What if the family that raised you spent years tearing you down until the day you came back to take everything they tried to steal? Madeline Whitman was the forgotten daughter in a powerful, image-obsessed family, labeled a failure, mocked for her dreams, erased from the legacy she helped build, until one secret, one letter, and one final courtroom showdown changed everything. This is the story of silent revenge, buried truths, and a woman who turned quiet brilliance into billion-dollar justice. Stay with us to witness how the underestimated became unstoppable, and how some ghosts don't stay buried forever. The roast beef was dry, but so was the silence between them. The crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, yet no one raised a toast. Madeline Whitman sat in her usual spot at the long mahogany table, nudging a fork through the mound of potatoes without ever lifting it to her mouth. If anyone noticed, they didn't say. If anyone cared, they never had. Across from her, Graham held court like always, laughing too loudly, waving his wine glass with an arrogance so practiced it passed for charm. "I mean, really," he was saying, leaning back in his chair. "Who needs a smart collar for a dog? What's next? Therapy sessions for goldfish." He smirked as the table chuckled along, all except Madeline. She kept her eyes on her plate, pulse steady. "That's what you've been working on, isn't it, Maddie?" Graham tilted his glass toward her, pretending curiosity. "Still tinkering with your little passion project?" Madeline looked up slowly. "It's called Poprin Systems," she said evenly. "And yes, I still run it." Elise, their mother, winced, as if Madeline had broken some unspoken rule about asserting herself. "Your brother's just joking, honey. You know how boys are." "No, I don't," Madeline replied, softer than anyone expected. "But thank you for clarifying." Graham raised an eyebrow, amused. "Touchy tonight, aren't we? Maybe it's all that stress from trying to sell high-tech chew toys." Madeline didn't answer. Her phone vibrated quietly under the table. She glanced down. A text from Elliot. "Press release is locked. Google signs off in the morning." Her heart thudded once, then steadied. She pressed her phone flat against her thigh and looked up. "I heard Whitman and Co. had a bit of a hiccup with that biotech merger," she said casually. "How's that going?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. For a fraction of a second, Graham's smile faltered. "It's progressing," he said after a beat. "Some minor issues. We're restructuring parts of the deal." Madeline nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't mention the confidential report she'd seen just 3 weeks ago. Debt-laden acquisition target, inflated projections, red flags buried deep in line items. She certainly didn't mention how she'd gotten access. Google had shown her everything. The wine flowed, the conversation shifted. But the room never recovered from that one quiet question. Later, as she helped her mother clear the table, Elise offered a sigh dressed in concern. "You know your brother just wants what's best for you, Maddie." Madeline stacked the plates carefully. "I know what Graham wants. He wants to win." Their father, Howard, hovered awkwardly nearby, drying glasses as if the act could erase the tension. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "I'm fine," Madeline said with a tight smile. "Actually, you might want to turn on CNBC tomorrow morning." Howard looked at her, puzzled, but he didn't ask. He had always been good at pretending not to see what made others uncomfortable. By the time she stepped out into the cold, Manhattan night, her breath fogged in front of her. Her heels clicked against the stone walkway like the ticking of a clock. In her coat pocket, her phone vibrated again. A second message from Elliot. "We did it, Maddie. It's real." She paused under the street lamp. Above her, the windows of her childhood home glowed with warm, filtered light. But inside, the warmth was always conditional. Perform well, stay quiet, don't challenge the order of things. She looked up at the second-floor window, where the family portrait used to hang. They'd replaced it recently, she noticed, because her face was no longer in the new one. Tomorrow, they would all remember her. The subway ride back to Brooklyn was quiet. The way she liked it. A jazz saxophonist played a haunting tune near the end of the car, his case cracked open at his feet, a few crumpled bills fluttering inside. Madeline sat alone, coat folded tightly around her, the smell of cold metal and old stories clinging to the air. She stared at her reflection in the window. Sharp eyes, soft jaw, a mouth used to silence. For a long time she had tried to make peace with it, being the invisible one, the afterthought, the other child in a family of stars. Her building was modest, a converted brownstone walk-up on Bergen Street, nestled between a shuttered bookstore and a Dominican cafe that always smelled like home. She climbed the narrow, fitting door with a code she changed weekly, just in case Graham ever got curious. He'd always said paranoia was unattractive, but paranoia had also saved her company more than once. Inside, everything was quiet. Her apartment was sparse but intentional. Steel-framed bookshelves, sun-faded sketches, a framed patent certificate above the desk, and on the windowsill, a small wooden box containing Nina's collar. She moved toward it, fingers brushing the metal tag. Nina Whitman. If found, please call home. No one ever had. Madeline flicked on the lights and set her phone on the kitchen counter. One missed call, unknown number, no voicemail. She opened her laptop, the blue glow washing across her face. The homepage of Poprin Systems lit up, a clean interface, elegant, minimalist. She hovered over the technology tab, then clicked through the development dashboard. Data streamed in from thousands of active callers across the country. Vital signs, movement patterns, behavioral changes. 2 flagged reports blinked in red. The AI was working. It was saving lives. She smiled, but not for long. A second tab waited, minimized, confidential, Google acquisition packet, final, signed. She opened the file and let her eyes skim the numbers. $5,500,000,000, 0 cents. Full integration, lead directorship under Madeline Whitman. Press release scheduled for 7:00 AM EST. All major outlets pre-briefed under embargo. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from years of holding this moment in her chest like a burning coal. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. For 4 years she had soldered sensors in a rented basement lab, skipped meals to pay her engineers, and stayed awake through nights of code and grief. And all the while, Graham had laughed. "Let me know when your dog's ready to buy stocks," he once joked at Thanksgiving. Madeline reached for a small envelope tucked behind her desk lamp. Inside was a photo, her, Nina, and their mother, smiling by the kitchen sink before everything went cold. Before inheritance lawyers and you're being over-emotional, and Graham telling her the company wasn't real unless he could value it in market multiples. She slid the photo back, stood, and crossed the room. On the wall near the entryway was an old intercom speaker she had never replaced. She pressed the button and said, "Rael, are you there?" A few seconds passed, then, "I'm always here, Maddie. What's up? Is everything ready for tomorrow?" Press teams on standby. Margaret triple-checked the release, and Elliot already scheduled the team breakfast. "Want me to cancel?" Madeline shook her head slowly, as if Rael could see her. "No. Let them eat. They earned it. Copy that." She released the button and exhaled. Madeline turned off the lights and walked to the window. The skyline shimmered under a moonless sky. Somewhere uptown, Graham was probably sipping scotch, still laughing, still winning. But the scoreboard was about to change, and when it did, she wouldn't need to shout. She'd just show them. Tomorrow, the world would know her name, and it wouldn't be because Graham allowed it. It would be because she took it back. At 7:59 a.m., the only sound in Madeline's apartment was the soft gurgle of the French press on the counter. The sun had barely broken through the frosted Brooklyn skyline, casting pale amber light across the hardwood floor. Her coffee mug, dark ceramic chipped at the rim, steamed in her hand as she stared at the muted television screen. CNBC's anchors sat poised, a bright ticker crawling beneath them. She didn't need to hear the words. She already knew what they'd say. Then, at 8:00 a.m. sharp, the chyron changed. Break-in. Google acquires Poprin Systems for $5,500,000,000, 0 cents. Her face appeared just beneath the headline. CEO in animal healthcare space. Her face appeared just beneath the headline. Smiling, confident, a photo taken 6 months ago when she still lived on black coffee and granola bars and couldn't afford a PR team. She took a sip of coffee as the segment cut to clips from a Poprin demo event in San Elliot speaking on stage. A dog wearing the Poprin collar nudging its owner as the biometric alerts pinged. Rail called 30 seconds later. "Guess what's trending?" he said, not bothering with hello. "Don't say it." Maddie Whitman, top 5, across platforms. She let out a quiet breath. I thought they'd go with the brand, not the person. They went with both. Bloomberg's calling you the silent architect, and Financial Times just dropped the phrase, revenge through innovation. Madeline laughed softly, the sound foreign in her own kitchen. "I'll head to the office by 9, she said. "Let the team have their moment first." "They're already here. Elliot brought donuts. There's confetti, literal confetti, Maddie." She smiled, ending the call. The emails flooded in within minutes. Congratulations from former investors who once declined, media inquiries from outlets that had ignored her pitches, a half-dozen invitations to speak at conferences she used to sneak into with fake badges. She didn't reply. Not yet. She glanced at her second phone, the one only a handful of people knew about. A message blinked from Margaret Evans. "Board acknowledgement confirmed. Transfer complete. You're officially on Google's leadership role. Proud of you." She set the phones down and watched the news segment shift to Whitman and Co. Her brother's face filled the screen, pale, tense, the corner of his mouth twitching as he exited a boardroom. The headline beneath him read, "Biotech Murder Under Scrutiny. Murder Whitman and Co. faces pressure over due diligence failures." Poetic timing. The same morning she broke the news, Graham was walking into a fire of his own making, and he had no idea she'd already seen the numbers that started it. The AI-assisted audit Google used had flagged inconsistencies in the biotech firm's liabilities. Madeline had cross-referenced them herself weeks ago. The firm Graham's team was trying to merge with had debts stacked behind shell entities, all dressed up with clean fronts ready to collapse under one good look. She hadn't outed it. She didn't need to. The truth had its own momentum, and now it was rolling downhill fast. Her intercom buzzed. She walked to the panel. "It's your mom." Rael's voice crackled through. "She's downstairs." Madeline hesitated. Then, "Let her up." When the elevator door opened minutes later, Elise Whitman stood in the hallway, wrapped in a designer coat, a tension behind her eyes that no amount of foundation could smooth over. Her purse swung nervously as she stepped inside. "I had to see you," Elise said, voice hushed. "I figured you might." Madeline gestured toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" Elise shook her head. She walked to the window instead, looking out over the city like it might offer clarity. "Is it real?" she asked. "All of it?" Madeline leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Yes, Mom. It's real." Elise turned around slowly. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall. "Why didn't you tell us?" Madeline met her gaze without blinking. "Because I needed to see how you treated me when you thought I had nothing." Elise sat down on the edge of the couch, like someone unsure they were welcome, fingers twisting the strap of her purse. The silence between them was heavy, but not new. It had been there since Madeline was 16 and realized that silence, in this family, was the preferred method of dismissal. "We were worried about you," Elise said finally, voice thin. "That apartment, all those long hours," Graham said. Madeline raised an eyebrow. "Graham said I was wasting my life." Elise flinched. He didn't mean it that way. Never does." Madeline moved toward the window, watching a cab slide through the slush below. "I built something that saves lives, Mom. I built something that matters, but that wasn't enough for any of you, was it? Not unless it came with stock options and a corner office on Park Avenue." Elise stood abruptly. "You know your brother. He's under pressure. He's always been the one expected to carry the family name." "I never wanted the name," Madeline said, voice steady. "I just wanted to be seen." Elise didn't answer. Instead, she stepped toward the shelf beneath the window, where Nina's collar sat in its wooden box. She reached for it, fingers trembling. "She was just a cat," she said softly. Madeline's eyes snapped to hers. "She was everything." A beat of silence. Then Elise looked back at her, for once without condescension. Just age and something that looked dangerously close to regret. "I saw you on the news," she whispered. "I saw what you did." "I'm proud of you." Madeline's throat tightened unexpectedly. She didn't want those words. Not today, not this way. But something in her chest shifted anyway. "Thank you," she said, because it was easier than saying everything else. Elise nodded, then moved to the door. As she reached for the handle, she paused. "Your brother is having a hard time. There's talk about the merger falling through. He might be in real trouble." Madeline tilted her head. "And you're here. Why, exactly?" "To ask if you can help him." Madeline blinked. For a moment she almost laughed, but instead she walked to the door, opened it slowly, and stepped aside. "No, Mom, I can't, not this time." Elise lingered for a second too long, then walked out into the hallway, the click of her heels fading, like a chapter closing. The door shut with a soft finality. Madeline exhaled and turned back toward the living room where her phone had just buzzed. A new message from Rael, Whitman & Co. reached out. They want to discuss possible investment in Poprin. Should I respond? She stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed, "Tell them to contact Google's corporate development team. We're not independent anymore." Before she could lock the phone, another notification appeared. An email from an anonymous sender. No subject line, just a single sentence in the body. "Ask Graham what he did with the envelope your mother left." Her stomach twisted. She tapped the screen again, saved the email, and forwarded it to Margaret with the note, "Let's dig." Then she walked to her desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a faded folder marked Personal 2017. Inside were printed bank statements, her mother's old prescriptions, and a copy of the non-compete clause Graham had slipped into the family trust amendment. The one she'd found buried behind 5 pages of legalese 3 years too late. She placed the folder in her bag, straightened her coat, and looked one last time at Nina's collar. Then she headed to the office. It was time to stop watching. Time to act. The lobby was nearly empty when Madeline pushed through the front doors of her building, the early evening chill still clinging to her coat. The doorman gave her a polite nod but said nothing. He didn't have to. The sight of the man sitting stiffly in the waiting area, shoulders hunched, suit rumpled, eyes hollow, told her everything. Graham. He stood the second he saw her, but she didn't speed up. Instead, she moved slowly, deliberately, as if walking toward an inevitable rerun. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not cold, but not welcoming either. He glanced toward the security desk. "Still listed as your emergency contact," he said, almost sheepishly. "You never changed it." Madeline didn't smile. "That was an oversight." Graham's gaze dropped. "Can we talk?" "No," she replied, "but we can walk to the elevator together." He followed her, dragging his designer briefcase like an afterthought. Once inside, the doors slid shut, sealing them in the narrow, sterile space. The hum of the machinery filled the silence. Graham shifted on his feet. "My career's falling apart," he blurted finally. "The merger's collapsing. Compliance found inconsistencies we didn't catch in time. Now everyone's circling. Board, regulators, even the feds." Madeline stared ahead, unmoved. "I'm surprised it took them this long." He turned to her, face pale. "You have to help me." She looked at him then, not the confident, smirking brother who always had a punchline ready, but a man stripped bare, and it stirred nothing. "Why would I do that?" she asked. "Because you're my sister," Madeline scoffed. "That only mattered to you when I was beneath you." The elevator dinged. Her floor. As the doors opened, she stepped out, but paused, turning back. "I sat through years of dinners while you made jokes at my expense. You mocked my work, my apartment, my decisions, and all the while I kept building something real." Graham opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "You don't get to ask for help now just because the roles are reversed. You never respected me, Graham. You never thought I mattered unless I could serve you." He looked stunned, like someone realizing for the first time that consequences come with echoes. "I was wrong," he said. "Okay? You want me to say it? You were right. You made it. You win." "This isn't a competition," she replied calmly. "It never was, but for you, it always had to be." He followed her a step into the hallway. "Then what is this? Revenge?" She shook her head. "No. This is a boundary." With that, she turned and walked down the hall. He didn't follow. Inside her apartment, Madeline let the quiet settle around her. Her phone buzzed once on the table. A new message from Margaret. "Got something. Found a scanned version of Elise's will. It's different from the one Graham submitted to probate. We need to talk." She read the message twice. Then she walked to the shelf where Nina's collar rested and sat beside it, staring at the city lights through the window. Graham's downfall might have begun today, but the full story wasn't over, and neither was hers. The next morning brought no clarity, just a deepening fog of unanswered questions. Madeline sat in her office at Poprin headquarters, the sunlight behind her muted by matte glass walls. Her fingers tapped quietly against the armrest of her chair, eyes locked on the projection screen where Margaret Evans had just pulled up the two versions of Elise Whitman's will, side by side. "There," Margaret said, pointing with the end of a capped pen. "This version, the one submitted by Graham, removes you from the clause regarding Elise's intellectual property, investments. But this one," she clicked, "the version recovered from Elise's former attorney's server, names you explicitly, full rights to any proceeds from projects she contributed to, namely Poprin." Madeline said nothing at first, just stared. The words blurred slightly. "I didn't even know she had anything tied to Poprin," she murmured. "We had one conversation, maybe two, before she got sick." I showed her the first schematic. I didn't think she took it seriously. Margaret offered a slight shrug. "Apparently she did. She made a silent contribution through a holding account, $50,000. We traced it. It was used to fund your second prototype." Madeline leaned back in her chair, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and something dangerously close to grief. "She never told me," she whispered. Margaret softened. Maybe she couldn't, or maybe she was trying to make it right in her own way. The screen went dark as Margaret shut the file. "I can file a motion to reopen the estate," she said. "Challenge Graham's version. We can prove manipulation. He submitted a forged version of the will. That's criminal fraud." Madeline nodded slowly, but didn't speak. Her mind was already elsewhere, spinning through old memories like reels from a forgotten film. Elise at the kitchen table, hands trembling. Graham taking the pen from her fingers. "Let me help, Mom. I'll handle it." It hadn't meant care. It had meant control. "I want to see the originals," she said finally. "All of them. Every draft. Every note. Every lawyer she ever contacted." "I'm on it." When Margaret left, Madeline sat alone, the hum of the office barely audible beyond her glass door. She turned to the shelves behind her desk and pulled down a leather box she hadn't touched in months. Inside were documents she'd once thought worthless, handwritten calculations on old envelopes, napkin sketches from late-night brainstorms, and tucked at the very bottom, a photo. Her mother, younger, standing in front of a research lab. On the back, in smudged ink, "Sometimes what matters doesn't look impressive until you're far enough away to see the shape of it." A knock on her door. Rael stepped in, holding a tablet. "You're gonna want to see this." He turned the screen toward her. A live feed from a finance podcast was streaming, the title across the bottom. "What happened at Whitman & Co.? Sources say internal whistleblower has surfaced, pointing to forged documents in recent estate proceedings." Madeline's blood ran cold. "Someone leaked it," Rael said quietly. "Not us," she replied. "Not yet." But it didn't matter. The story had legs now. It was running through the industry like a lit fuse. Her phone buzzed. Unknown caller. She hesitated, then picked up. "Madeline?" Graham's voice was taut, frayed at the edges. "Did you do this?" "No," she said calmly. "But I'm not going to stop it either." Silence. "You think you're better than me now?" he asked. "I don't need to be better," she answered. "I just need the truth to be louder than the noise." She hung up and placed the phone down gently. For the first time in years, Madeline felt something shift, like a door creaking open, long rusted shut. And behind it wasn't just justice, it was clarity, and she was ready to walk through. The marble floors of Whitman & Co.'s headquarters gleamed under the recessed lighting, immaculate and cold, like the people who once walked these halls with purpose, like Graham, like Elise. Madeline adjusted the Google badge clipped to her blazer and stepped through the glass security gates without hesitation. Her heels clicked against the floor with measured precision, each step echoing through the cavernous lobby as if announcing something inevitable. Two receptionists glanced up. One recognized her instantly, the other clearly had no idea who she was. That was fine. By the end of the morning, everyone would know. A junior associate led her up to the 27th floor. The boardroom had changed little since the last time she'd been here. Same panoramic view of the East River, same long, glossy conference table, same leather chairs arranged like chess pieces. Only this time, she wasn't here begging for venture funding with a pitch deck and a shaky voice. This time, she had the upper hand. The board of directors filtered in slowly, older men in tailored suits, two, women with sleek hair and tablet-thin laptops. They whispered politely, glancing at Madeline, clearly not connecting her with the headlines just days earlier. Only when Graham entered, his tie loose, jaw clenched, did the room shift. He stopped short when he saw her. His eyes widened for half a breath before his professional mask slid into place. "Madeline," he said evenly. "Mr. Whitman," she replied, just as cool. They both sat, opposite ends of the table like adversaries at a deposition, and in a way, they were. The chair of the board, Arthur Hale, began the meeting. "We're here to evaluate Whitman & Co.'s AI portfolio in light of Google's interest in acquiring select technical assets following the failed merger." Madeline clicked a button on her tablet. A presentation sprang to life on the main screen. Charts, graphs, risk analysis, and projected valuations all cross-referenced against internal reports Graham had filed. "Our team has reviewed your proprietary trading algorithms," she began, voice crisp. "While the headline claims are ambitious, we've identified major red flags, including gaps in predictive accuracy, questionable data sourcing, and lack of compliance with emerging SEC transparency standards. She advanced to the next slide. In addition, we've uncovered code overlap with third-party vendors your firm didn't disclose. At least 2 modules appear to violate licensing agreements. The murmurs around the table thickened. Graham shifted in his seat. These are early-stage integrations, he cut in. We're still refining. Understood, Madeline said, eyes never leaving him. But Google doesn't acquire wishful thinking. We acquire standards. One of the board members leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, were you aware of these discrepancies? Graham's face flushed. Our teams are siloed. I was briefed on the final product, not development code. Madeline didn't smile. She didn't need to. As the questions continued, her phone vibrated silently in her lap. A message from Margaret. A state court has accepted preliminary petition to challenge will. Judge granted motion to freeze Whitman Trust disbursements until hearing. Madeline slid the phone back into her bag. Graham was still speaking, but his voice had grown strained. His charm had dulled. She watched him falter under the weight of scrutiny he had once reserved only for others. Mostly for her. Funny how the boardroom felt different now, not just because of the title she carried, but because she no longer needed anyone here to validate her presence. She belonged, and they all knew it. The meeting dissolved 20 minutes later into a half-hearted Q&A. Though no one seemed particularly eager to speak, most of the directors sat back in their chairs, faces blank or skeptical, some glancing at Graham like they had already begun the slow internal pivot towards self-preservation. One by one they excused themselves, murmuring polite thanks to Madeline and nodding without commitment. Only Arthur Hale remained, his hands folded neatly on the table. "I remember when you came here the first time," he said, once the others had gone. "You were what, 26? You had that janky prototype with the copper wiring sticking out." Madeline smirked faintly. "It shocked my wrist every time I tried to upload data." "And still," Hale said with a dry chuckle, "you pitched it like it was the future. Guess you were right." She stood, gathering her things. "Guess I was." He gave her a long look. The Whitman name used to mean something in this building. Your father, your brother. They made it loud. Madeline's tone was quiet but firm. "I'm not here to carry anyone's name. I'm here to make sure people stop hiding behind it." She left the room without another word. Outside, the air was brisk and biting. Madeline walked with purpose toward the black car waiting at the curb, Margaret already inside, typing rapidly on a tablet. "How bad was it?" Margaret asked without looking up. "Graham cracked," Madeline said, sliding into the seat. "Not all at once, but they saw it. He knows he's finished." Margaret handed her the tablet. "Then this will be the nail." Displayed on screen was a scanned letter. Elise's handwriting. Unmistakable. The full version of the letter that had been omitted from the formal will. It wasn't just a postscript. It was a declaration. If anything happens to me, Madeline inherits all related to Poprin. She started it. She built it. Graham had no part, and he must not control what he didn't earn. Below the letter was a signature, dated 3 weeks before Elise's death, witnessed by a private notary. "Where did this come from?" Madeline asked. "Anonymous courier," Margaret replied. "Left at my firm's front desk this morning. No return address." Madeline stared at the screen, her throat tightening. Her mother had known. Had tried, in her own complicated, too-late way, to make it right. And Graham, he'd buried it. Not just the letter, the truth. "We file this immediately," she said. "Already done. Hearing scheduled for Friday. The judge wants you present." Madeline nodded and looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away from Midtown. People on the sidewalks passed like blurs, busy, detached, chasing whatever their day demanded. But she felt something slow inside her, something that had been racing for years. Not peace, not yet, but momentum bending, softening. Back at Pryan HQ, the lobby buzzed with activity. Reporters were already camped outside the glass entrance, hoping for a quote. Madeline ignored them. She walked up the stairs, past the front desk, through security and into the glass elevator that overlooked the city. As she rose, she pulled out her phone. A message blinked on the screen. From unknown subject, not just Graham. Body. You're not the only one he lied to. Queens, Friday night, Cafe Indigo. Come alone. She stared at it for a moment, then screenshotted it, forwarded it to Margaret, and saved the address. Outside, the sky was shifting into late afternoon gold, casting the city in a soft, deceptive warmth. Madeline closed her eyes for just a second. She could almost hear Elise's voice in her memory. Quiet, fragile, trying to be strong. Sometimes what matters most is the thing no one believed in, except you. And this time, she wouldn't let it be silenced. The file folder was heavier than it looked. An unremarkable manila envelope, thick with photocopies and original pages yellowed by time, creased at the edges from being read and reread. Madeline held it on her lap like a relic as the car pulled up to a modest law office tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner in Brooklyn Heights. The shingle above the door read, Lewis and Benton Family Estate Law. She had never been here before, but her mother had, quietly, without telling anyone. Margaret met her at the door, face unreadable, but eyes sharp. This is where Elise filed the first draft, a month before the one Graham submitted. The receptionist still remembered her, said she was determined. Madeline nodded and followed her inside. The office smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. An older man, Mr. Bentham himself, greeted them with a weary professionalism and led them to a small back room. The walls were lined with locked drawers and the blinds were closed tightly against the gray afternoon light. She didn't want a digital record, he said as he pulled a key from his desk drawer. She said she didn't trust computers anymore, especially not when her son could outsource a hacker with a phone call. Her words. He unlocked one of the drawers and pulled out a slim black binder, placing it gently in front of Madeline. She opened it slowly, expecting legal jargon, but it wasn't just legal language. Inside were handwritten notes, Elise's familiar cursive scrawled in the margins, alongside sticky tabs and arrows. Several lines were underlined, circled with force. Poprin was Maddie's from the beginning, no one else, especially not Graham. At the very back of the binder was a sealed envelope. Madeline hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a letter. Maddie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I had more courage while I was alive, I would have said these things to your face. I failed you, not just as a mother, but as someone who should have protected you from him. I let Graham dominate this family, and I let his voice drown yours out because it was easier. I told myself you were strong enough to not need my defense, but that was an excuse. You deserved more than silence. Madeline's hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. You took what little I gave you and made something extraordinary. You didn't inherit your father's business sense or your brother's charm. You inherited something far rarer, conviction. I was proud of you, even when I didn't say it, especially when I didn't. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not here, not now. Margaret broke the silence gently. This letter, combined with the original draft of the will and the financial trail of her contribution to Poprin, that's everything we need to file for fraud. Madeline nodded, closing the binder carefully. Then we file. As they stepped back out into the chill air, her phone buzzed. A message from Rael. CNBC wants a comment. Board of Whitman and Co. officially suspending Graham. SEC launched inquiry. Also, Elliot just found something weird in our server backup logs. Looks like an old user profile tagged Elise Wiss. Hidden file. Trashed. Want us to decrypt? Madeline stood there, stunned for a beat. Elise had accessed their development logs? What had she seen? She typed back. Yes, send it straight to me once it's open. Don't share with anyone yet. Something about the timing didn't sit right. Her mother had done more than write a letter. She'd left a trail, and Madeline was finally ready to follow it, wherever it led. By the time Madeline returned to her apartment, the sun had dipped behind the skyline, leaving long streaks of rose and ash hanging over the East River. She dropped her coat across the back of the chair and opened her laptop with the urgency of someone chasing a thread just seconds from being pulled away by wind. Rael's email was waiting. Subject: Decrypted file E_notes_final. Attached: audio transcript plus folder of annotated documents. She opened the transcript first. It was a dump of voice recordings, her mother's, clearly. The first began with static and a faint clatter. Then Elise's voice, low and careful. If you're listening to this, Madeline, I couldn't find a way to say it in person. I tried. I really did. But every time I opened my mouth, Graham filled the room with noise and confidence, and I let myself believe that you didn't need me to speak. Madeline leaned back in her chair, one hand over her mouth. The recording played on. I accessed Poprin's server to see your work for myself. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know what you built, without the filter of your brother's scorn. And Madeline, it was brilliant. Not just the tech, but the care behind it. The way you thought about animal suffering, about families losing. Too late, you created something human in a world that only values what's loud and sharp and fast. The breath caught in Madeline's throat. The next file was shorter. Elise's voice faltered slightly, like she'd recorded it during a sleepless night. Graham intercepted my draft. He knew I had filed it. I found out later he convinced the estate attorney I had changed my mind, filed a new version through a firm he'd worked with during his mergers. But I didn't change my mind. I just ran out of time. Madeline stopped the recording, stared at the waveform frozen on screen. For a long moment the room was silent, the only movement the steam rising from a cup of untouched tea. She opened the attached documents, scanned copies of old schematics, annotated with her mother's handwriting. Tiny notes like, could this double as a stress sensor, or add color-coded feedback for ease of use. Her breath hitched. Elise hadn't just observed, she'd contributed, quietly, with humility. Her mother hadn't invested just money. She'd invested belief. Her inbox pinged again, this time from Margaret. Subject: urgent. Hearing moved up. Thursday morning. Judge: accelerated schedule after press leaks. Graham's attorney already filed an objection. I'll handle it. Just be ready. Madeline responded with a simple, understood. Let's move. Then she sat still for a long time, staring at the screen, Nina's collar glinting faintly from across the room. She'd spent so long building, clawing upward, trying to outpace the shadow of her brother's voice and her mother's silence. And now, just as the dust began to settle, she realized the silence had never been absence. It had been struggle, a quiet resistance. Her phone buzzed again. This time, a new name. Unknown number. He's not done. He'll fight with what's left. Ask Rael about the backup log on the Indigo server. She froze. Cafe Indigo. Queens. Friday night. The anonymous email hadn't been a bluff. It was a breadcrumb trail. And now it pointed not just to Elise's intentions, but possibly to what Graham had tried to bury entirely. She forwarded the message to Rael with one line: find out what he's hiding. All of it. Then she stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the glittering sprawl of a city that had ignored her for so long, but not anymore. The hearing was coming. So was the reckoning. And if Graham still thought he could win by rewriting the past, he had no idea what kind of memory she'd inherited. The Pacific glinted like hammered glass outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Madeline's new home. It was early, too early for email, too late for dreams, but she had already been awake for hours, the edges of sleep fraying with every tick of her bedside clock. The Long Beach house was silent except for the sound of waves rolling in and retreating, steady, indifferent, timeless. Madeline sat at the kitchen island, her finger hovering over the send button on an email that contained only one word in the body. No, it was addressed to Graham's legal team, his latest, most desperate appeal to settle the estate quietly, to avoid further press, to preserve the family's legacy. The irony of that phrase made her jaw tighten. She pressed send. Outside, the ocean didn't flinch. The kitchen smelled of salt and fresh coffee. Margaret's car would arrive in 30 minutes to take her back to Manhattan for the hearing, but Madeline had insisted on spending the night here. She needed the distance. She needed the reminder that there was life outside the Whitman name. Something she'd built herself, from ashes and wire and grief. She walked through the hallway, past a framed photo of Nina curled beside a Poprin prototype, past the wall lined with handwritten letters from pet owners, the real proof of what mattered. In the far corner sat a small sunroom she hadn't let anyone else touch. On the shelf inside was a single object, Elise's ring box, unopened, just as it had arrived last week in a courier envelope, with no sender. Inside had been the ring Elise always wore, the one she told Madeline was just costume jewelry. But hidden in the velvet lining was a tiny flash drive. Rail had decrypted it 2 nights ago. It held one file, a video. In it, Elise sat on a couch in her old apartment. Her hair was thinner than Madeline remembered, her face drawn, but her eyes, those were sharp, alive. If Graham tries to sell you the story that you're imagining things, don't believe him. He changed my will. He knew I wanted to leave it to you, and he used my illness to isolate me. I was scared, Maddie, not of him, of how far he'd go. The video had 2 minutes, no ending, no goodbye, but it had been enough. The sun was higher now, slicing through the gauzy curtains in pale ribbons. Madeline stepped into her bedroom and changed into the navy blue suit she'd chosen for the hearing. Not severe, but not soft either. Understated, powerful, a mirror of her mother's style when she was younger, before the family name became a cage. As she fastened the last button, her phone buzzed. From Rael. Backup logs from Indigo server confirm it. Graham wiped a shared archive 6 days after Elise's death. Timestamp matches with IP from his home network. I'll bring screenshots. Madeline stared at the message. She wasn't surprised. Not anymore, but the confirmation still twisted something inside her, a final, undeniable stamp of betrayal. Downstairs, Margaret was already waiting in the car. Madeline climbed in without a word. Neither of them spoke until they reached the courthouse. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she noticed the cameras, the microphones, the crowd already gathering. Press, bystanders, strangers who knew only the headlines. But Madeline, she climbed the steps without looking back. She had inherited more than a company. She had inherited a voice, and today it would be heard. The courtroom was wood-paneled and spare, bathed in late morning light that streamed through high windows. It smelled faintly of old carpet and paper, like most courtrooms, timeless and unimpressed by wealth. Madeline sat at the petitioner's table, Margaret beside her, a thick binder open between them. Across the aisle, Graham looked like a man unraveling. His jaw was set, but the corners of his eyes twitched each time the judge asked a question. His attorney, slick, impatient, had already objected twice before the first 20 minutes were through. Neither objection stood. Judge Moreno, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, flipped through the documents in front of her. Let me get this straight. she said calmly. The original will, the one filed by the respondent, omitted a handwritten letter by the deceased and was submitted through a secondary law firm, one previously employed by Mr. Whitman during corporate negotiations. Yes, Your Honor, Margaret confirmed. We have chain of custody documentation for both versions and a verified timestamp from the notary who witnessed Elise Whitman's original intent. The newer version contradicts both her verbal and written declarations. Judge Moreno raised an eyebrow. And this letter, she held up the page with Elise's wavering cursive, was discovered recently. It was recovered from the deceased's retained counsel, then verified against an identical scan on a secured device, encrypted and found among the decedent's personal effects, Margaret said. There is also a video message to support intent. We have submitted a digital copy to the court. Graham shifted. He hadn't spoken yet, but now he stood. Your Honor, he said, voice strained. With respect, my mother was unwell. She may have written many things. That doesn't mean they were legally sound. Madeline looked up at him then, not in anger but in something quieter. Pity, perhaps, or maybe just clarity. Judge Moreno leaned forward. Mr. Whitman, are you suggesting your mother was incompetent at the time of her signing? I'm suggesting she was vulnerable, Graham replied. She had moments of confusion. She didn't always know what she wanted. Madeline stood. She knew, she said simply. The judge turned to her. Elise Whitman was quiet. Madeline continued, but she wasn't confused. She left a trail. Letters, logs, a ring box with a hidden drive. She knew someone would try to erase her. She knew who. The courtroom stilled. She may not have shouted, Madeline said, her voice steady. But she wasn't silent. And today, she's finally being heard. Graham's lawyer tried to object again, something about emotional appeal, but Judge Moreno raised a hand. I've heard enough. She reviewed the final pages, flipped through the forensic data Rael had compiled, and finally nodded. In light of the submitted materials, verified communications, and the respondent's lack of transparency, she said, this court rules in favor of the petitioner. The Whitman estate will be amended to reflect the original terms of Elise Whitman's will, including full recognition of Madeline Whitman's rights and ownership of assets related to the Poprin venture. A pause, then the gavel came down. Court adjourned. The room exhaled. Margaret leaned over and whispered, It's done. Madeline didn't move. Not yet. She let the moment settle. She didn't need applause. She didn't need Graham's reaction. What she needed was what Elise had never gotten, acknowledgement. As she turned to leave, Graham caught up with her in the corridor. You've made your point, he said bitterly. Madeline stopped. You still don't get it. He frowned. Get what? This was never about winning, she said. It was about truth. You tried to silence her. You tried to erase me. And now you have to live with the fact that it didn't work. She walked away, each step quieter than the last. Outside, the sky was wide and blue, the wind sweeping in from the ocean. She could smell the salt, feel the weight lift from her chest. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. Rail again. Letter from the Poprin team waiting at the office, and a package from a woman in Indiana. Says your tech saved her dog's life. Madeline smiled. She had nothing left to prove. Somewhere the ocean roared, and this time she didn't have to answer back. Thank you for watching this story. If you've ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, even by your own family, know this. Your worth isn't defined by who claps for you, but by what you build when no one's watching. Madeline's journey reminds us that real power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it works in silence, until the truth becomes too loud to ignore. To everyone still fighting to reclaim their voice, their dignity, their place, keep going. The world may try to rewrite your story, but only you get to decide how it ends. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, true, inspired stories. Until next time, stay strong, stay grounded, and never stop believing in your own voice.